Hi, it's Carolyn. I'm here to help you learn how to bake and decorate amazing cakes. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to decorate this Minecraft cake. If you want to skip the intro and get right into the video, there are chapters linked below. But I just wanted to say something real quick before we get started. It was over 10 years ago, I made this Minecraft cake and I have hated Minecraft ever since. I rarely make them and I have turned down so many Minecraft orders because this cake made me want to quit cake decorating. So after over 10 years, I decided to try it again, and I'm so glad I did because I love the way that it turned out. I'm starting with my cakes already baked, filled, iced, and they are in the refrigerator waiting to be decorated. I have tons of videos showing you how I do that entire process, and those will be linked in the description. I will also link down there all of the tools that I use and any other videos that I reference. So let's get started. All right, to start, I just wanted to show you real quick, when I do square cakes, I always have a little cake board underneath it that is about a ½ inch bigger than the cake that I'm making. I do have a video where I explain how I ice buttercream cakes in full detail, and I'm going to link that in the description for you. But I make sure that this bottom board is equidistant on the cake drum, and then I'm going to push that all the way down. So I have a little bit of tape underneath, then I get some icing down on it, and then I'm filling the cake. Now, when you want to make a cube, you need to make the cake really tall. So it has to be 3 layers so it looks like a cube. If I only did a 2-layer cake, it would be too short. So when you're making a cube, like this Minecraft cube, you want to make sure that it is square the whole way around. So that's why I recommend 3 layers. So I filled it. I'm wrapping it up in the plastic wrap and letting it settle before I ice it. And again, you can check out my video on how to ice square buttercream cakes below. Now I have this Gumtex powder, Tylose powder, CMC powder. It's all the same thing. This is mixed into all of my fondant. I only use marshmallow fondant. You get the best result when you use marshmallow fondant. And you sprinkle a little bit in there, knead it into the fondant, roll it out, and let it sit. And it's going to set a little harder, and it's going to make it so much easier to work with. I will link this in the description. I have a piece of non-slip pad underneath my cutting board so it doesn't slide around, an X-Acto knife with a wet paper towel, a Dresden tool, a needle tool, and a little bit of water. And it took me about an hour and a half to color all this fondant and roll it out and let it sit. So I had to look at the pictures and make sure I have all the right colors that I need, and I rolled that fondant out really thin. You can see how thin it is. And I printed out this picture the size I wanted it to be on the cake. I have this square plunger cutter, and I'm just cutting a bunch of squares. Now I have that cake box lid. I always cut the lids off of cake boxes and keep them for stuff like this. So I am just cutting a bunch of tiny squares out of all of these colors. So I have all of those pictures that I use are going to be linked in the description below for you. But I just want to make sure I cut enough of every color. And you see there's some of that teal color in that picture as well. So I'm just cutting out a bunch of squares. And then I rolled that brown fondant out pretty thick, and this is going to be on the top of the cake, so I need to get a skewer in that brown fondant. You'll see a little bit later. So I just want to make sure that I'm getting these in the right position. And look, I'm looking at the picture and just making sure I'm putting the right color down in the right spot. And now I have all of the squares on here, and I need to cut this out. So first I want to make sure that everything is straight. I'm taking a palette knife and just straightening all of these pieces. And since this is a thicker piece of fondant, I'm not cutting it all the way out first. I'm just making a guideline, and I'm cutting exactly along the edge. I'm not cutting a border around here. Usually I cut borders, but for this I'm not. So I'm making sure I get a guideline in there, and then once I have that guideline, then I stick the tip of my knife all the way down to the cutting board and cut it out. So this is a little tricky because there's so many angles in this. So I'm just working in little sections and slowly cutting this away from that piece. Like I'm cutting all the excess pieces away. So I just keep wiping my X-Acto knife off on that wet paper towel as the fondant starts to stick to the knife, and just cutting all of this brown fondant away. And good. Once that is done, I'm going to flip it over on a cutting board and use my tools and use my fingers and smooth it from the back. Now this is going to be a topper, so the back of this needs to look as nice as the front. So you always want to take your time and smooth your cuts, because anytime you cut anything out of fondant, the edges are going to be a little jagged. So I'm just smoothing the edges, flip it over and smooth it again from the front. And then I'm just going to realign it on top of this picture to make sure it dries to the correct shape. Now, this bottom handle is going to be sticking out the side of the cake, so I want to get a skewer in it. So what I did, I wet that skewer and I'm putting it right in the center of that thicker brown piece, and I'm twisting it in there, like I'm screwing it in like a screwdriver. You don't want to jab it in because you don't want to distort the piece. So I'm making sure that it's not poking out the front or the back, and I'm keeping it level. And then this side is the side that's going to go down into the cake. So again, I'm sticking it right in the center of that brown part and screwing it in, making sure that it doesn't poke out the front or the back. Now, the one that's in the handle, I have to cut and remove the excess. So I pushed that fondant up a little bit because it's still a little soft, and then I pushed it down. So I just took my snips and cut that. That way, that handle is not going to distort and it's going to stay in the correct position, and let's set that aside to dry. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the sword. So I cut out a bunch of those squares like I did before. This fondant is a little thinner because this is going to go on the side of the cake, so I don't have to get any skewers in the bottom. And again, I'm looking at the picture and just assembling these squares to look like the picture. And then now, since this isn't a very thick piece of fondant, I can just cut this. I don't need to do that guideline first. So I'm sticking the tip of my blade all the way down to the cutting board and cutting it out. Again, working in little sections to make sure that I don't mess it up. And then when that is all cut out, I'm going to flip it over and quickly take my fingers and just smooth it from the back. This is going to be up against the cake, so you won't really be able to see it from the back. And then I'm going to realign it on the picture to make sure it dries to the correct shape. And I just want to smooth it from the front as well with my fingers. And just realign that on the picture, and I'm going to get that on a cutting board and let that sit out at room temperature so it can dry hard. Now I'm making a bunch of different squares, and I finally got one of these square cutters from Amazon. I will link it below. So I just rolled that fondant out really thin like I did before, and I'm just cutting a bunch of squares. This is going to be on that Minecraft block on the bottom tier. So I need a bunch of different shades of brown and also green, but I cut out the green a little bit later. So I'm going to start with the brown since the brown is at the bottom of the cube, and let's set those aside. Now, this took a while, so I'm showing you the time. So it's 2:40. I got that cake out of the refrigerator. Remember, this icing is solid. I'm marking an arrow to the front of the cake, and I'm taking a wet paper towel and just removing that icing that's on the cake drum from when I iced the cake. Now, this might be a little hard for me to explain in a voiceover, but I'm going to try. So I figured this out as I went along. I kept changing my method here. I also cut out some gray squares because there's a couple gray squares in the Minecraft block, and I wanted to make sure that I had them. So I started off by using a little bit of piping gel. And remember, this is the very front of the cake. You always want the front of the cake to look perfect. So I'm sticking that bottom square off a little bit off to the side. Do you see how it's sticking out over the edge? Because I want the front part of the cake to cover any seams that come up the side of the cake. So I got a little bit of piping gel behind this other square. And when I went to stick that down, there was too much of a void because that icing isn't perfect and it caves in a little bit at the corner. So I wanted to get a little bit of icing down to fill that in. That way that other block would not sink in too far and it would still be flush with the edge of that front piece. So I'm trying to make it look like this is perfect. Like I always say, my cakes aren't perfect, but I know how to trick the eye to make it look like it. So do you see how that block was sticking back a little too far? I used that needle tool to pull it out a little bit so it is straight. So as I said, when I started, I just was getting piping gel on the back of all of these pieces and sticking it down. And I could slide them over to the correct position. And again, at this corner, it was the pieces were going back a little too far, so I had to bring out the icing and fill in that void. That way the squares started to sit flat. And that one on the right, it just sticks out a little bit over the edge like I wanted it to. Now, I'm looking at that block over there and it is still sunken in a little too much. So I need to get a little bit more icing behind it. So I'm trying to build that up with a little more icing so it's not sinking back behind that dark brown piece too much. And now since I built it out with that icing a little bit, I can make it look like it's meeting that dark brown square in the perfect position. And I want to do the same thing on the other side. So I feel like that icing needs to be sticking out a little bit more so the blocks that I put down aren't going to be too far back. So I'm just building this out with some icing and trying to put these down so that light tan one is flush with the back section of the dark brown one. Do you see what I mean? So now I can just start to stick these down to that icing because that icing is still sticky. And now I see this block at the back of the cake really sticks out a lot. So I'm trying to slide all the blocks a little bit more to the front. That way this back one doesn't stick over the back edge so much. So then I did the same thing on the other side. So I did the very front first. I worked down one side and then I'm working down the other side and I'm going to finish the back last. So I'm trying to slide these blocks towards the front so that back block again doesn't hang over the back edge too far. And you see how far it's hanging off. That's okay. We're going to fix it, but we just want to try to make this look perfect. And then I figured, what if I get some icing behind each of the blocks and then try to stick that onto the cake? I think that'll work out so much better, and it totally did. So what I'm doing, I'm getting a huge glob of icing down there. That way, I don't have to press it all the way against the cake. I'm just pushing that block against the cake so it is even with the other blocks, and it just makes it so much easier to make everything look nice and even. So again, I started in the front, I went down one side, and then I'm going down the other side. So do you see how much icing I'm getting behind these blocks and then sticking it on? I'm not pushing it all the way down. I'm just pushing it to make sure that it is even with all of the other blocks. So I'm just getting that on the right side of the block where it's going to touch the cake and stick that down. And then every time that I did a row, I took my fondant smoothers and just kind of pushed them against the cake, trying to make sure that everything was nice and straight. And then this was the method that I stuck with for the rest of the blocks, and it made such a difference. So I'm getting a glob of icing behind each of these pieces, and I'm pushing them down just far enough so they are perfectly even and flat with the other blocks next to it. And when you do these colors, I had a picture, and the picture will be linked below, but it's just kind of haphazard and random with the colors. Some of the same colors touch. There are a few gray ones in the mix of all the browns, so I'm just trying to make sure that I look at the picture and try to make it as similar as possible. Now there was a big dip in that corner there, so I had to add a little bit more icing behind that in order to make it straight. Did you see how I did that? And I'm just being very careful not to push it against the cake too far, like I keep saying, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I'm just trying to make all of the squares even with the one next to them. And I haven't even filled in the back of the cake yet, so I'm waiting to do the sides first, and then I will figure out the back. So with square cakes, it is very difficult, and this is why one of the reasons why I don't do them. It's difficult to get them perfectly square in a perfect cube. Like if this was a perfect cube, all of the squares would line up, but I knew that they wouldn't. That's why that there is a back of the cake. Now that one was sunken in a little too much, so I used my needle tool to remove it, and I got a little bit of icing behind it, and this one as well. It was just curving in too much into the cake, and I wanted to pull it out a little bit. So just again, getting icing behind these pieces and sticking them on. And do you see how those back pieces are sticking out past the back of the cake? That's why that's the back of the cake, and I'm going to figure that out a little later. But just taking my fondant smoother and smoothing it out after I do every row, and then just continuing the process. Now here are the green ones that I rolled out, and the Minecraft block, there's green at the top. So do you see when a block is green, there's only green above it? So once I put a green block down, you can only have green going up on top of it. So I'm going to start to add some green in here. Again, just kind of looking at the picture, and I'm still doing brown and some green on this row. And again, I feel like this corner goes in a little too much, so I got a lot of icing behind that one. That way I can make it even with the other blocks. So you see I'm putting green on top of green. Whenever there's a green one, I have to put green on top of green as per the picture. I want to make sure that I do this correctly. So now remember, I started this at 2:40. It's now 4:02. It's been an hour and 42 minutes, and this icing is starting to get soft, so I need to put it back in the refrigerator because I don't want to mess it up as I'm working on it. So I'm just going to stick that back in the fridge, and now I'm going to cover this middle tier with the red fondant. So I have some piping gel here. I just got that cake out of the refrigerator. The icing is solid. I'm not going to mess it up. It's nice and cold, and I have a little bit of water that I'm using to thin out the piping gel all along the sides. And I have a video where I go into detail on how I cover a cake in marshmallow fondant, and that will be linked in the description. So I have this red fondant here. I'm going to sprinkle down some cornstarch and roll it out to about 1/8 of an inch thick. And once I have it rolled out, I'm going to take my fondant smoother and just smooth it out, get rid of any air bubbles that have formed in there, and I'm going to lift it up and place it on top of the cake. Now this fondant does have a little bit of that Tylose powder, Gum-Tex powder mixed into it. It helps make it stretchy, and it doesn't have elephant skin. It brings it to a great consistency. I have a video where I talk about how to get your fondant to the smooth consistency, and I will link that below. But I'm just pulling it out, getting rid of any wrinkles, using my fondant smoother to press that against the side of the cake, and use my pizza cutter to cut off the excess. And then I'm taking a piece of fondant to smooth the fondant, and then I want to get a nice sharp edge, so I'm using my little pinch technique, and I'm just sliding my fingers together to create a sharper edge here. Not squeezing really hard because then you're going to put fingerprints on the cake, so don't do that. Now, don't come at me. I have this cutting wheel that Wilton made, and it's a cake dividing wheel. They don't make it anymore. I got it like 20 years ago. I think they may have it somewhere. I could try to find it, but I may not be able to find it. But this is how I'm going to divide my cake into equal sections. I'm sorry, I have to use this in the video. This is the only way that I like to do it. However, if you can't figure out how to divide your cake into sections using a wheel, or if you can't find the wheel, you can measure your cake and see the circumference of it. So, whoops, I let that go. So what I did, just take a tape measure, wrap it around the cake. It's probably like, what, 24 inches, and then divide that by however many sections you want, and that's how wide your section should be. I really wish Wilton would bring this back. It would be so much better if they did. But anyway, so I want 12 sections in here, and it's labeled 12 at the edges. So I'm just finding all the lines that say 12, and I'm using my Dresden tool just to make these vertical lines in this cake. And this is going to be like the TNT block on the Minecraft. And then I'm taking my Dresden tool, and you see how I'm using the curved end? I'm not using the pointy end. I don't want to poke a hole in the fondant. If I poke a hole in the fondant, I'm going to be so mad because I don't feel like starting all over or patching the hole. So I'm just using that curved end, and I'm working in little sections and just deepening all of these lines. And that looks good. I'm going to put that back in the refrigerator so that fondant can solidify. And now it's 5:07, so that cake has been in the refrigerator for about an hour, and that icing was able to solidify a little bit. I'm using my fondant smoother to make sure everything's straight. And now, do you see how far those blocks are sticking over the back of the cake? I need to fill that void in with some icing before I even start to get icing behind the blocks to stick them on. So I'm just trying to fill in that extra space. And I'm using those blocks as a guide. I don't want the icing to stick out further than those blocks. And again, I'm figuring this out as I go along. So I'm getting some icing behind the back of that and sticking it down. Again, trying to make sure that they are even with each other. Now, when I finished the row, there was too much of a void. So what I'm doing, I'm shifting all the blocks over to the left, and I'm going to have to cut blocks to fit, and I'm going to have that at the back right edge. So I'm just shifting everything over a little to the left, getting a little more icing behind it, just so everything is nice and flat. And do you see that little piece on the end here? It's not a full block. So what I did, I just measured how much I have to cut off, and I just cut it off a camera. I just cut a piece off of that, and then get a little bit of icing behind it and stick it down. Now it's flush with the back of that other side. So I'm doing the same thing. Do you see how much icing I'm getting behind this? So there's a lot more icing towards the back of the cake, but that's what we got to do to be able to get this nice and flat. And now the cake gods were on my side because this is nice and even with the top of the cake. I don't know when that ever happens. I must be having a good week with the cake gods. So I got all of those on there and it is flush with the top of the cake. So I did the front and then I'm going back one side and back the other side. And at the very top, it is all green squares. I'm just trying to make it look like the picture. All right, so I got the cake out at 5:07. It's been about 45 minutes for me to get the rest of those blocks on the sides. Now, I just want to show you, if these blocks did not come to the very top of the cake and I wasn't able to easily fill it in, what I would do. So I would make sure that the icing is nice and solid and the cake was cold, and I would take a knife and just use the top of those squares as a guide so I can cut off the excess icing and make it nice and flush with the top of those squares. If the squares were sticking over the top of the cake, kind of like what happened at the back of the cake, I would just take some icing and fill in the void to try to make it nice and flat, put it back in the refrigerator so the icing could solidify, and then I would fill in the little squares on the top of the cake. So luckily the cake gods were on my side, but if they're not on your side, you can either trim off the excess icing or fill it in with a little more to make sure it's nice and even. Now, time check here, it's 5:55, make a wish, and let's fill in the top of this. Now, I am putting a 6-inch round cake on top of here, so I only need about 3 rows down each of the sides. I don't have to fill in the entire thing. So I'm just making sure that these are nice and even with the front of the cake, and I was getting a little bit of icing underneath each of those. And then do you see how it's not matched up perfectly with the side of the cake? I can't go crazy trying to make it perfect. I'm going to go insane, right? So I just had to be okay with it being a little off. Trust me, with all the decorations and everything going on with the cake, you're not going to notice that it's slightly off. So I have 3 rows across the front. Again, I'm always starting at the front because I want that to be the most perfect. And then I'm working down the right side. So I'm getting 3 rows down the right side. Then I use my little fondant smoother to press that down. And then I work back to the left side of the cake, going to the back, and there's a void in the back, so we're going to take care of that. But again, flattening it with my fondant smoother and continuing that row across. So you see if I go straight across, there's a little section there that's missing. So I'm going to have to cut little squares to the correct size and fill in that little void. Again, this is the back of the cake, and hopefully nobody will notice. So again, like I said, I'm putting a 6-inch cake on top of this, so this section is going to be covered. I'm just filling that in with some icing so it's nice, and I'm taking my fondant smoothers just to make sure everything is nice and straight. Let's do a time check. It's 6:41. I took that cake out at 5:07, so that was another hour and a half, a little over an hour and a half. It was a total about 3.5 hours to get all of these squares on the cake. You can see this back section is where those blocks are uneven. I'm going to make sure that's the back of the cake, but look how good that looks. Let's put that back in the fridge to solidify. Now I got my cake out of the refrigerator and I have my airbrush machine here, and I love this thing. There's the dial that controls the pressure, and I have the on-off switch, and I have you pull the trigger back in the gun to control the spray. Now I want to spray this with a little bit of red and some black. I just want to deepen the red color, so I got some red airbrush coloring. You must use airbrush coloring in an airbrush machine or else you're going to clog it with gel colors. So I'm just lightly spraying red all over that cake to deepen it, and then I rinse the gun out. You don't see me do that. I rinsed it out with hot water, and then I'm adding some black airbrush coloring, and I'm just deepening all of these lines in here. And then once that's done, I'm going to lightly spray black all over the cake just to give it a little bit more depth. And that looks really good. Let's put that back in the fridge. Now I want to make the 5 topper. So I printed this number 5 out the size I wanted it to be. I measured my cake and I wanted to see how big I wanted that 5 to be, and that's how big I printed it out. I had this brown fondant rolled out really thin, and then I had this other brown fondant rolled out a little thicker because, again, I want to get a skewer into that fondant, and it needs to be thicker for me to be able to do that. You will see what I do. Now I want to get these squares on here, so I use that square plunger cutter and I cut a bunch of squares like I did earlier. And I just want to lightly trace this number onto this thin brown fondant to make sure I get these squares in the correct position. And I'm going to get some water all over that number 5 to make sure I cover the entire area with these squares. Now I'm mimicking this number to look like the squares that are on that bottom tier, and I can use my palette knife to make sure I get everything nice and straight. I want to push these squares exactly up against each other and line them up like I did on that bottom tier of that cake. Remember, the top of it was green, and then there's some green and brown interspersed, and then it's like all brown as you get to the bottom. So I'm making it look like that bottom tier. Take my palette knife to make sure everything is nice and straight. And then I want to trace this number 5 on here, make sure it is straight so those squares are straight on the 5. Now I can't trace it with a Dresden tool or else I'm going to drag the squares all over the place. So I'm just taking my needle tool and pricking little polka dots around the edge of the 5, and then I'm doing a shallow cut again because I don't want to drag this through those squares because I don't want to distort the square. So I'm kind of just sawing up and down until I get that guideline, and then once I have the guideline, I'm just using that to cut this out. That way I won't distort all of the squares. Flip that over and smooth it out from the back, and then I want to get a little bit of water on the back of it, and I'm going to take that thicker piece of brown fondant and I'm going to flip it upside down. So the smooth part is facing down, and I'm going to press that down on that number 5 and then flip it over, and voila, it's transferred onto that thicker brown fondant. Use my palette knife to make sure everything is nice and straight. And now since this is a thicker piece of fondant like before, I want to just stick the tip of the blade in there to create a guideline first, and then I will cut the entire thing out. So when you do centerpieces like this, it's a little tricky. I'm working in little sections, and I'm making sure I'm pulling the fondant inwards. That way I'm not going to distort the edge of that center piece. And then I'm going to try to pull that out the center, use my tools and my fingers to smooth that before I cut the rest of it out. So number 5s and any numbers that have holes in the middle are kind of annoying. Like 1 and 7 are my favorite because there's no, it's just straight lines. But then again, I'm just cutting all of this excess fondant away. And then once I have that done, I'm going to flip it over and again, take my tools and my fingers and smooth it from the back. This is going to be on the top of the cake, so you want the back to look nice and pretty. And then flip it over and smooth it from the front. Make sure it is perfectly straight, and I'm going to set that aside on that cutting board to dry flat at room temperature for a couple days so it could dry really hard. Now I'm making the border and I'm rolling that black fondant out really long. Take my ribbon cutter and cut a long ribbon here and use my rulers and straighten that out. Make sure it dries nice and straight. And now I want to stack my cakes. So like always, my hands are always clean when I handle my cakes. And I got that out of the refrigerator. And remember, the back section is where the blocks are all messed up. So I want to make sure that is the back. And I can't use my ruler because this cake is too tall. So this is what I do. I take my straws right up against the side of the cake. I get level with it. And then I mark the very top with a Sharpie marker. And then I take my scissors and I cut that marker off. Hold it up against the cake, make sure that is the correct height, and it is. So now I'm going to use that straw to base the height of all the other straws. So I'm lining them up on the bottom and then just cutting the excess off. And let's stick all of those straws in that bottom tier. And I'm going to get my level and make sure it is level across all of the straws. And I have a stacking tutorial where I go into detail on how I stack cakes, and I will link that in the description for you. I'm getting a little bit of icing down. And then I got that out of the refrigerator, and that cardboard circle underneath is going to sit atop of those straws and prevent the cake from collapsing. I'm making sure that it's center and then making sure that it's level. And this time I can use my sewing ruler to measure the height of the straws. So I'm just marking where that ruler ends on the straws, and then I'm going to cut that marker off and throw that other piece away and stick those straws into the cake. Make sure that it is level. Get down some icing, and then I got that top tier out of the refrigerator. Remember that icing is hard and solid. I'm not going to mess it up. Stack that on top of the cake, and then I dowel it through the cake down into the cake drum and cover that little hole with some buttercream. Now I have some piping gel here. I want to get this border on here. I'm starting at the very back and just getting a little bit of piping gel around the whole perimeter of that bottom part of that middle tier. Start in the very back, and I'm wrapping that black border that I cut earlier around where it meets in the back, cut the seam and press the seam together. And then I'm taking a dry paintbrush and just removing that excess cornstarch. And I realized that this black fondant looks a little gray, so I want to bring out the color in it. So I have a little bit of vegetable shortening here, and I'm just brushing this shortening along that black fondant. Now, if you have a steamer, you can use a steamer. I don't have a steamer. I find this just to be a lot easier. So I'm just brushing shortening on here, and then I'm taking a dry paintbrush and just removing the excess shortening. And look how much it deepens that fondant to a nice dark black color. Now I want to see how wide I want to cut this white ribbon, and it was about 2¼ inches. So I'm going to put that back into the refrigerator, and I want to get my ribbon cutter to the correct width, and I'm just holding it up there, and it looks like that's the right width. I rolled that white fondant out really thin and long, and I'm just cutting a long white strip here, the correct size that I measured. Use my fondant smoother to smooth it out, and my rulers to make sure that it is nice and straight. And then I want to make the name kind of like the TNT block. It's made out of squares, so I'm just using that square plunger cutter to cut out all of the letters, or all of the squares, and form the letters of his name. And let's set that aside. Now I got my cake out of the refrigerator. I'm using a little bit of piping gel in the very back where that white band is going to meet. The piping gel has a stronger hold to it, so I like to have it in the back where the seam is. Then I'm going to use some Crisco vegetable shortening around the entire center section where that white band is going to go. The Crisco is very forgiving, and I can move the band into the correct position with the Crisco shortening. If I used water or piping gel, I wouldn't be able to do that. So I'm starting in the very back, and I'm wrapping this band around the entire center of the middle tier. And again, where it meets in the back, I'm going to cut it to create the seam and then push those pieces together. And here's where I need to make it look nice and perfect. So I'm using my palette knife. I'm going around the top edge and the bottom edge to make sure that it's nice and even. Then it was sticking down a little bit too much. So I used my fingers to pull that band up, and I can do that because there's that Crisco shortening behind it. So I can easily manipulate this into the correct position. And I'm just getting eye level with this band and trying to make sure that it is perfectly straight across the top and on the bottom. And using my dry paintbrush to remove any excess cornstarch. Now I want to make sure I get the name centered on this cake, so it's about 6 inches wide. I want to try to find the center, and it looks like the part of the first N is the center of the cake. So that's where I'm going to try to center this name. I always try to find the center and make sure I center the name. So I'm getting a little bit of piping gel behind all of these squares and sticking them down. And once I get them down, I can move them into the correct position. Use my palette knife to make sure everything is nice and straight. And the TNT lettering on the TNT block in Minecraft kind of looks like this, so that's why I decided to do it this way. And again, just trying to get these all nice and straight after I get them down onto the band. And that looks really good. I'm going to put that back in the refrigerator. Now I need to make the blocks for the skeleton block that's on the top tier. So I did light gray, medium gray, dark gray, and white, and I'm going to set those aside. And then I'm getting my cake back out of the refrigerator. And remember, this icing is cold and solid. I'm not going to mess it up. So I'm starting in the very back of the cake, getting some piping gel behind all of these squares and sticking it down. And then I thought it would be easier just to get piping gel on the cake so I can stick the squares down. And I started doing it that way. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I don't know if these squares are going to come to the top of the cake, and they wouldn't. So I need to put a border down first. So I have to remove all those squares that I did. And then I rolled out gray fondant and cut a little piece of a border just to see if that's the correct thickness. And I'm making sure that these line up correctly, and that was. So I'm wrapping a border around the bottom of the cake first, and then getting piping gel around it, and then I'm going to put the squares on. If I didn't have that border at the very bottom, the squares were going to be short from the top of the cake, and I would have been so mad if I totally forgot to do that. You saw how I stacked the squares on top of each other towards the top of the cake just to see how high they were going to come. That's how I can judge how tall the squares are going to be. And do you see how it just comes right over the top of the cake? It looks nice and pretty. I'm using my fondant smoother to make sure that is nice and straight. And that looks really good. Let's put that back in the refrigerator. And now I am making this little creeper. Is that what its name is? A creeper face? I don't know. So I printed that out the size that I wanted it to be. And I'm just using my Dresden tool and doing the trace cut and smooth method to cut this out. So I trace it onto the fondant, cut all the pieces out, and then smooth my cuts. And then this gray square was the perfect size that I want to put on the bottom tier. The green one was a little too big, so I'm tracing the gray one onto this green fondant. And then I'm using my ruler and lining it up with that line I made on the fondant and just cutting a perfect square out. And then I'm going to flip that over, get a little bit of water on the back, and then put that down on this black piece of fondant and make sure those edges are straight with my palette knife. And then I'm putting these in place before I glue them down with water. And I'm just looking at the picture and making sure they're in the right position. So get some water behind each piece and stick it down. And then once all of them have the water behind it, I can use my fingers to manipulate them and get them into the correct position. And then I want to cut an even border. So again, I'm lining my ruler up and cutting an even black border around the whole thing. Let's set that aside on a paper towel. And then I want to get this ribbon cutter to be that exact width of that face on that white block. And I'm cutting long ribbons on here, 2 dark ones and 1 light one. And then I'm just aligning those right on top of the eyes. And do you see how I'm using the eyes as a guide and cutting those to the correct width? And I do the same thing for the mouth. So I'm lining it over the mouth so I can see where it begins and where it ends. And I'm just cutting it to the right width and doing the same thing for the nose as well. And now I got that out of the refrigerator, and let's decorate this. So I have some piping gel here. I'm getting piping gel around the perimeter and a little bit of icing in the center. I like to use icing because once it goes back in the refrigerator, it really solidifies and it holds that against the cake so it's not going to go anywhere. Making sure that is center to the front of the cake, and then I want to put the little skeleton face on there. So I'm starting with the mouth, and it's offset to the bottom section of the block, so that's why I did it a little lower. I was just looking at the picture and sticking that on there and using my palette knife to make sure everything is nice and straight. And then again, I'm using my dry paintbrush just to remove any excess cornstarch that is on the cake. And I want to deepen that black in the creeper face. So again, I'm getting a little bit of Crisco on a paintbrush and just painting the vegetable shortening on the eyes and the mouth. And then I will use a dry paintbrush and just go over it again to remove the excess. And look how much it deepens it. It makes it look so much darker. And now I want to put these decorations on the cake. So this pickaxe and this sword I made a couple days ago, and every day I would flip it over. That way it could dry from the back, dry from the front, and these dried really hard, so they are going to hold their shape. So I always make decorations like that a couple days in advance so they can dry really hard. Let me hold this up against the cake and see where I want it to go, and then I'm going to get some icing behind it wherever it is touching the cake. And I'm going to stick that down and press the icing against it. And again, when that goes back in the refrigerator, the icing will solidify and really hold it on there. Then I'm taking a dry paintbrush and just removing any excess icing that was sticking out. Now for the topper, I totally forgot to film this, but I put the skewer in the bottom. And again, like I did before, I twisted it in there. I didn't jab it in. However, I can't stick it straight through the center because you were going to be able to see it. If I stuck it straight to the right, you'd be able to see it. I want it to go through the bottom where it's going to touch the cake, but it has to go on an angle. That way you won't be able to see it. So I'm sticking this over to the right side of the cake. That way it'll angle down and that stick won't poke out the side. If I stuck it down to the left side, the stick would poke out the side. So I need to put the 5 over to the right. I hope that makes sense. So I'm sticking a toothpick next to the skewer. That way when I stick it in the top of the cake, it won't twist, get some icing underneath it. And I'm just holding these up to see where they're going to go in the cake. When I press that down, I'm going to use a dry paintbrush just to remove any excess icing that is sticking out. And then I'm holding this up to see where it's going to go into the cake. I'm going to get a little bit of icing underneath it where it's going to touch the cake, and I'm pushing that down. And then I just want to, again, remove that excess icing with a dry paintbrush. And as I move this, that pickaxe started shaking, and I got so nervous that when I deliver the cake, it's going to shake too much and it won't hold itself. So I gave it a little test here and I started shaking it and I'm like, I don't like that. That doesn't look very sturdy. So I removed that and I want to stick this down on an angle. That way the handle of it can touch the cake and it is just a little more sturdy. I like the way it looked the other way, but this way I can be sure that it's not going to fall as I deliver this cake. And then I just removed the excess icing. And then I have some of these extra squares that I'm just sticking around the cake. So I'm putting it on the very top of the cake and then all around the bottom of the cake board as well. And here is the Minecraft cake. How awesome is that? There you go. I just love this cake, and I'm so glad that I decided to try Minecraft again. But a few things that I wanted to go over with you about this cake. Number one, it is not perfect, and especially with square cakes, it is so difficult to get the edges perfectly straight, the corners perfectly sharp, and that's one of the reasons why I steer clear of doing square cakes a lot. But like I said in the video, I have a tutorial showing you how to ice a square buttercream cake that will be linked in the description. But this cube that I made, it is not perfect, and that's why there's a back of the cake. And trust me, there's so much going on with that cake, people really won't realize that the squares are a little off in the back. And about the name Thin just happened to be the perfect name to put on that middle tier, like the TNT block. The way that I decorate the cake sometimes depends on the name. If that name were really long, I wouldn't have been able to do it that way. I probably would have had to cut the letters out in a different font to make it all fit. And a lot of people ask if I sketch my cakes, and for this one I did, because she said she wanted the skeleton guy, the creeper guy, a Minecraft block, the pickaxe, and a sword. So this is the sketch that I came up with, and it looks pretty similar to the cake. I'm not big on sketching cakes. I do it just to let people know the idea that I have. And look at the comparison. I think it looks a lot like the sketch. So the inside of this cake, the top tier is a 2-layer, not torted 4-inch. The middle tier is a 2-layer torted 6-inch. And the bottom tier is a 3-layer, not torted 8-inch. And I have a video talking about when I tort and when I don't tort my cakes, and I will link that in the description. And it feeds 50 to 55 people or so. So I think that's it. What new techniques did you learn in this video? I would love to know. Leave it in the comments below. And just a reminder, I do have a Cake Academy membership program where I can help you elevate your cakes to the next level. All of that information will be listed in the description. Please like this video if you liked it, and if you're enjoying my tutorials, I would be so grateful if you could buy me a coffee. My link is down below. And I would love it if you would keep in touch on socials, and you can check out my website. And if you want to stick around, you can watch this video next, and hit subscribe and the bell if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching. I love you guys, and remember, it's cake, have fun. I will see you on the next one. Bye.